Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. How many of you consult Dr. Google on a regular basis? Yeah, I think a lot of us probably do. If you do a search for love on Google, you're going to get 12.8 billion responses. Results, I guess, is the actual word. 12.8 billion with a B. Now, if you were to do a selection for enemies, you're going to get 580 million. Now, I guess we should take some solace in the enemy part is less than half of the love part, but there's still 580 million results of all the websites that Google catalogs that has enemies in it. So if you do a search for examples of loving your enemy, you get 9 million. 9 million results. Now 9 million is a big number. It's nowhere close to 12.8 billion. It's nowhere close to 580 million, but it's still 9 million. So that's a good thing. You might understand that we're going to talk a little bit about loving enemies today. Loving your enemies is hard, isn't it? It's something that we all probably struggle with. And honestly, when you do a search, these are this week's statistics, by the way, because I did these on my own. I was trying to find great examples of people loving their enemies. And unfortunately, there aren't a lot of recent examples, at least that have been cataloged in such a way that it comes up on that kind of Google search. Matter of fact, you have to go back, unfortunately, quite a long way. One of the most prime examples comes from the Civil War era. So 1861 to 1865. We have the war between the states. Slavery, of course, was the issue. And you have the challenge of brother versus brother. There's one really shining example of this. This gentleman is Kentucky Senator John Crittenden. And this guy was trying to figure out a compromise as the war was just getting started. Well, unfortunately, during the course of the war, he had two sons. Their names were George and Thomas. One fought for the North, one fought for the South. I got to think that wasn't very comfortable for John Crittenden. But one of my favorite, one more Civil War example, Mary Todd Lincoln. Okay, so here's the wife of Abraham Lincoln. She had 6 family members who fought for the Confederacy. How interesting is that? But my favorite example of loving your enemy comes from a little bit more recent. Still quite a while ago, it's World War II. So the person whose photo you see there is a Luftwaffe pilot named Franz Stigler. And Stigler was a fighter pilot in the German Air Corps. And he was fighting over Germany, and he comes across an American bomber. The American bomber was in a lot of trouble. It had bullet holes throughout. It was smoking an engine. It was having a hard time staying level. And so Stigler could have easily shot this thing down. It didn't look like it was going to take much more for it to plunge. But instead he pulls alongside it because he recognizes that it's not a threat. And he leads it to the sea so he could get away and go back to England where it was based. And as he pulls up, he sees the one pilot and they salute each other as the American pilot flies off. Now it turns out that American pilot was the only one on that crew still alive. Everyone else had been hit by bullets that had gone into the fuselage of the plane. And he makes it back. Now it's kind of interesting, the pilot's name is Charlie Brown. I have no idea if Charles Schultz did anything with that or not, but that's the guy's actual name. And these two met later in life. In the 1950s, they got together. And the interesting thing is, Stigler was asked, well, why didn't you just shoot it down? I mean, that was what your job was. And he said, well, there's a difference between war and murder. And he said that, yes, this person was my enemy, but it was no longer part of what it would have been murder for me to shoot him down because That just isn't how you do things. In his opinion, it wasn't how you did things in warfare. So that's an example of valor, I think anyway. But we don't have that many great examples more recently of valor such as that. And it seems to me like conflict is just something that we've learned to live with in society today. And I think we must like it. Even though we say we don't, because we don't do anything about it. We don't do anything to change the scenarios under which we live. We elect the same people over and over again. We talk a good game, but we don't put our actions to work to change anything. We've lived like this for a lot longer than this probably, but a lot of it goes back to 2000. Remember the contested election? And went to the Supreme Court for the presidential election. That really seemed to be a tipping point, at least for our country. But it's not just a United States thing. This is a worldwide thing. Conflict. And there are a lot of contentious issues. Think about contrasting ideologies that we have these days. We have Republicans versus Democrats. We have conservatives versus liberals/progressives. Urban versus rural. And two things that match up our last 2 years of life, we have maskers and anti-maskers, and vaxxers and anti-vaxxers. And we just have a hard time getting along. And that list doesn't even include the most contentious of things that we deal with. Get into a discussion sometime about climate change with some people. Or how about gun control? Abortion? Or in our denomination, the ongoing discussions and debate about inclusion of LGBTQ persons as ordained clergy or the ability to be married inside the church building. Those things all, maybe we start off with the concept of, preacher, okay, I get it. I don't agree with people on the other side of those debates. I get that, but I don't even really count those people as my enemies. I'm not going to dinner with them. I'm not inviting them over to my house, but I don't hate them. But then something happens. There's a school shooting. There's a Supreme Court nomination where the ideologues get on TV and go back and forth at each other. Or there's a pandemic, a surge in a pandemic at different times. Or there happens to be an election with people with contentious names that get involved, with last names of Clinton or Trump. That's all it takes these days to throw the match onto the gasoline. My point is that we don't necessarily start off viewing people as enemies, and we don't consciously do it, but eventually those people become those people, and we get mad. Well, Jesus would tell us that, okay, so other folks that we encounter may not be likable, but they're definitely lovable. Here are these words from Jesus on Luke chapter 6, verses 27 through 38. But I say to you, who are willing to hear? Love your enemies. Be good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on the cheek, offer the other one as well. If someone takes your coat, don't withhold your shirt either. Give to everyone who asks, and don't demand your things back from those who take them. Treat people in the same way that you want them to treat you. If you love those who love you, why should you be commended? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, why should you be commended? Even sinners do that. If you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, why should you be commended? Even sinners lend to sinners expecting to be paid back in full. Instead, love your enemies. Do good and lend expecting nothing in return. If you do, you will have a great reward. You will be acting the way children of the Most High act, for He is kind to ungrateful and wicked people. Be compassionate just as your Father is compassionate. Don't judge and you won't be judged. Don't condemn and you won't be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven. Give and it will be given to you. A good portion, packed down, firmly shaken and overflowing, will fall into your lap. The portion you give will determine the portion you receive in return. May God add a blessing to the reading, hearing, and understanding of Scripture. You heard a lot of things in there that you've heard, that I guarantee you've heard a lot of. Turn the other cheek. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's the golden rule, right? So we're all familiar with that. And we've even heard that phrase about loving your enemies. When we hear those words, what is Jesus really trying to tell us? Well, he wants us to love our enemies, and he says to do good. So in essence, he's kind of telling us all wrapped into one, dare to do good for people who are not necessarily your friends, who are not necessarily in your camp, who don't necessarily believe the things that you believe. We may think that sounds like a good idea because, after all, we've heard these words before. We understand it. Jesus has talked to us about that. We've listened, but we just don't do it. At least not as much as we should. And I think it's just a harsh reality that while we, as followers of Christ, really buy into the idea, we are not very good at execution. We struggle with it mightily. Now, there might be several reasons that we struggle. The first might be proximity. Let me explain that a second. Keep in mind what Jesus did. Jesus had to go everywhere he went. He encountered people who disliked him, who wanted him dead, literally, who did not want to follow his teachings. So he went straight to people he didn't agree with, or at least didn't agree with him. As adults, as people in this world today, even kids here today, I'm pretty sure we tend to disagree with people at times, and then we tend not to purposely go to those people. We tend to stay away from conflict. We tend not to get into the fight, so to speak. We will do what we can to keep our distance because we don't want conflict. Let's look at that concept for just a moment. Did Jesus really mean for us to do what he said? Love our enemies? Because another reason that we might not be very good at these things is because maybe we just disagree with Jesus a little bit. Jesus, that was good for you. You're the Son of God. You have control over your mental faculties and your emotions and all that kind of stuff. Maybe this is easy for you, but Jesus, I'm here to tell you, as somebody who's lived on this earth the entire time and wasn't just here for a while and then gone and back, all that kind of stuff, the world doesn't work that way. A little arrogant on our part, but maybe that's one of the arguments. Well, Jesus tells us to do good and to lend to sinners expecting nothing in return. And there's even a mention in there, did you catch it? It says there's a heavenly reward for those of us who do that. It's kind of a big thing, kind of important. It doesn't mean it's going to happen here in the here and now. You're going to have to wait for that reward if you decide to love your enemies. But see, I would argue that there actually is a payment in the here and now. It's not the heavenly reward. It's something I like to refer to as peace of mind. Think of how much energy you expend when you're angry with somebody. Have you ever held a grudge? How much energy went into holding that grudge? How much effort went into hanging on to anger? It's hard. Last week I used that Tim McGraw song, Humble and Kind. I took a section at the end of it to explain a concept. I want to do it today again, but from the beginning of the song, toward the beginning, he uses this concept of what weighs you down. And it goes like this. Don't expect a free ride from no one. Don't hold a grudge or a chip, and here's why. Bitterness keeps you from flying. Always stay humble and kind. Now, whether or not you like country music, I think those words from the songwriter standpoint are pretty powerful. Because I think it does weigh us down considerably when we try to hold a grudge. When we try to just hang on to anger. I think that takes a lot of energy. And it's a lot of wasted time. Grudges and or lack of care for others do indeed weigh us down. And I want you to think about it like this too. Anytime you tried to hold on to something negative, think back to a time, we've all done it at some point. Did anything positive come out of that? Not probably. Maybe, but I doubt it. Whereas if we try to do something positive, if we try to make amends, if we try to reconcile, almost always something positive comes out of that. Maybe not the full-blown happy ending that we're looking for, but usually there's a small sliver of something positive that comes out of that effort. It's a framework. So let's look at what Jesus said, and let's take a look at the context. Where did he say it and to whom? Remember I talked about last week, this is part of the Sermon on the Plain. So we had the Sermon on the Mount that's recorded in Matthew, all the blessed are those and thous and all that. And then he comes down the plain and he gives a similar message to a different group of people. Well, he's talking to farmers here. He's talking to the working class. And there are a few wealthier types that have mingled in. We talked about that last week, about how that led to that message. And Jesus is trying to teach them that you can't just say things. You have to actually do things. Intent is nice, but intent doesn't change anybody's life. Saying that you want to do something nice for somebody is great, but unless you actually do that, nothing really changes. Well, remember the excuses that we went over earlier just a few minutes ago. Remember the first one was that we just don't have the proximity to do it, and the second one was that we struggle with the concept that maybe Jesus just didn't understand what life was like. Well, I think he did understand what our lives are like. And I want to offer today 5 very brief things that should help us get past this concept of not being able to love our enemies. The first one is respect. And I think it's important for us to understand that there's an opportunity to have some relief when we show respect to other people. Jesus was talking on the plain, on the Sermon on the Plain, and he was gathered by a bunch of people, surrounded rather by a lot of people. And they had all kinds of different backgrounds that they came from. Yes, they were from the same area, but some of them were hard laborers. Some of them literally worked for the Roman Empire. Some of them were just wealthy and didn't probably have to do too much as far as effort and work goes. Respect. That's our first one. Show respect. Think of your enemies, and enemies might be too strong a word because I don't think anybody here is purposely going out and trying to find enemies. I'm going to go out on a limb. But people we disagree with, let's put it there, because all of us have those types of folks. Folks we disagree with, can we at least respect them? Can we see them as people, not as items against which to argue? Respect is important. Second of all, their shoes. They may not be Marvel shoes like you see on the screen, but put yourself in their shoes. We're kind of quick to criticize our opponents, aren't we? I know I can be at times. I was a newspaper editor for 20 years. I'm here to tell you I could get into some pretty good disputes. I was involved with political things at the state level, trying to get shield laws for reporters. We were involved in some pretty important stories about public safety that I had city council people, in particular one city manager that absolutely had we'll say a strong dislike for me. That was the way life was. But I had to put myself in his shoes. He wasn't used to being criticized. He wasn't used to being questioned on anything. And that's a big shift if you've never had that happen for you before. The point is, sometimes we criticize our opponents without understanding where they're coming from on this topic. We tend not to think critically anymore as a group of people. Not to say nobody in this room does that, but the idea is, as a society, we tend to not think super critically any longer. We tend to focus on television news, that what's the stance of this channel, and then we seek out that opinion. So when I was teaching Well, when I was a newspaper editor, I would get asked to come into college journalism classes. And they would ask me specifically to talk about bias. And they were always sheepish about asking, do you mind talking about bias? And I had actually no issue talking about that. And I did this study on ratings for CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. And I looked at it, what happened in 1990, what was it like in 1999? What was it like during the election of 2000? And then 18 months later, what were the ratings? Before that, it was always CNN was number one, MSNBC was number two, and Fox News was a very distant third. And then you had the Supreme Court election fiasco that happened in 2000, Al Gore and George W. Bush. I'm not here to argue about who should have won or which political stance you take. I'm only going to share with you the data. Within 18 months, Fox News and MSNBC were neck and neck. They had chosen a side. CNN tried to play it down the middle. CNN was a woeful distant third by the time those new ratings came out. People chose a side and they selected which network matched their ideas, and they've stuck with them because those ratings have pretty much, for the most part, stayed. It's been MSNBC and Fox News, and then CNN's been distant third. Next is common ground. Sometimes it's just important for us to acknowledge that we have differences. Agree to disagree. But then let's find some things that we actually have in common. For most people, love of family is a pretty universal thing. Maybe it's that you have a similar job or you have hobbies that are similar. Maybe it's something as simple as movies that you like or books that you read. Find some kind of common ground. And then, of course, forgiveness. Breaking the chains that hold us down from helping them to understand that we love them instead of want to confront them. The scripture today says, don't judge and you won't be judged. But later on, if we were to read the Apostle Paul, he's going to tell us that we are supposed to rebuke each other lovingly. Not from the standpoint of really judging somebody, but from the idea of helping us each stay accountable, to stay on the right path. That's important too. So here's what you should take from the idea of judge, don't be judged. Don't judge lest you be judged. It means that you have to be willing to put the same criteria to yourself that you've put on someone else. So are you willing to forgive? Because if you're not willing to forgive, you will be judged on the status of you aren't a forgiving person. Therefore, you don't get forgiven either. Think about interpersonal relationships, just in your family. I've told you before, I have two kids. When they were younger, they would be at each other's, especially when that 12 to 9-year-old difference, that was awful for a long time, at least for a year or two. And I just remember our daughter and our son going at it, okay? Eventually they figured out, though, that if they teamed up, first of all, mom and dad had a harder time playing defense against that. But they learned that as they would treat the sibling, their sibling would treat them the same way. I'm happy to say that as adults, they're pretty much best friends. So that worked out pretty well. It took a while to get there, but it worked out fairly well. The last one is prayer. And obviously these have been presented in reverse order of how we should go about things. Prayer should be the first thing that we do for people that we disagree with. But here's the hitch. It's not praying that they will come along to your way of thinking. Because I hate to tell you all this, but y'all might be wrong. We don't know. I know I'm wrong enough. My wife and kids will tell me that. I've come to agree that, okay, I'm wrong sometimes. We might be wrong. And so instead of praying for that person to come along to your side of thinking, pray for wisdom for them and for you. And that there can be some type of reconciliation. Besides, prayer can't hurt, right? That's something we should remember. So loving our enemies, it's difficult. We know that. But consider this. Jesus calls us to do what seems to be impossible because Jesus makes it possible. Jesus calls us to do what we would consider to be improbable because with Jesus it can be probable. And Jesus even calls us sometimes to do what is unreasonable because with him it is reasonable as long as we're willing to budge, even just a little bit. So remember, Jesus calls us to love unreasonably rather than to hate reasonably. I want to conclude today with what I think is one of the more profound quotes from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We're all familiar with the I Have a Dream speech. This is from one of his sermons. And then later a television interview that he did. Sometime I will show you. It involves pulling just everybody up by their bootstraps. You may have seen that one. That is, I think, his most profound statement. We'll save that for another time. But this one I think is important. He says, I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. It takes a lot of energy to hang on to grudges. So I encourage you today to help lighten your own load. And you do that by sharing love and giving that away. Taking the weight off your shoulders by sharing love instead of hanging on to, across your back, the hatred or just the angst that you may have for somebody else. Amen.